Let's be honest, the reason you buy a Proton Persona is not because you want it, but because this is all you can really afford. And as a result, the Persona has always felt a little bit unloved by Proton because they know that they don't need to spend that much attention on it and people will still keep buying them. However, it seems that Proton has finally changed tack, and now with this latest facelift, it seems that the Persona may finally be something that you want rather than something you need. Now, the facelift Persona has very few aesthetic changes, but they're still worth noting nonetheless. At the front for this premium model, you now get LED headlights, but the positioning and indicators remain as bulbs. You also get a new grille which incorporates the infinite weave design. And I must say that this with the round logo doesn't look too bad, although I personally still prefer the old Proton Shield. You also get LED daytime running lights as well for this car, which again smarten up the front quite a bit. Down the side you have 17-inch alloy wheels in a dual tone design wrapped in Goodyear Triple Max 2 tyres, and they look good. Admittedly, they're a lot better than the design that used to be on this. Now moving down the side, you get a black roof for reasons. You also get these door-mounted wing mirrors. The reason for this is because apparently it provides better aerodynamics, and you do get admittedly slightly better visibility through this quarter light. Now, on the iris, you used to get what was known as a side blade, but for the Persona, as I'm sure you've seen before, it sort of disappears into the rest of the bodywork. Whether or not that works is completely up to your opinion. Now at the back there are quite a few more changes. So for starters, the tail lights are still the same, but they're now slightly darker tinted, which make it look more sophisticated somehow, and it really works against this dark grey colour. You also get a black boot spoiler because of aerodynamics, and Proton script going across, as well as a new Persona badge over there. You don't get a Thundercats logo at the rear, unfortunately, because Proton would rather you read it, I guess. Now, the reason you buy the Persona over the Iris is because of boot space, and admittedly, there is quite a lot in here. Now, compared to the hatch, you can definitely get a lot more space in here. And even against segment contemporaries, the space in the Persona is still quite impressive. What is slightly less impressive, however, is the boot release. So it's an electronic boot release, but when you press it, it makes this... Now I'm going to do it again from when it's closed so you can... It's not a nice noise. But enough about the little fixtures and fittings. There are some more changes to be seen inside, so let's go over there. Now, on the inside of the Persona, there are a few more changes. So the overall design hasn't changed that much. It's still broadly the same interior that we've seen before, but there have been small tweaks in order to sort of update it. So for starters, you now have this floating central infotainment screen, and you have digital air conditioning controls. They're not climate, it's just AC controls. You also get 3 USB ports down here and a nice little slot that can actually fit a full-size flagship phone. You also get a new center console with this nice little bit of trim that goes all the way around, and I have to admit that it does look quite good and it smartens up the interior quite a bit. There are also 3 buttons up ahead, which is the Eco Mode button, the traction control button, and the front parking sensor button. And it's all nicely placed because when you're sitting here, it's very easily accessible. Now, the steering wheel is leather wrapped. These seats are faux leather, but they're done up in this nice sort of tan color, which is quite good, admittedly, because most of the time they usually go with beige. Having this nice brown smartens it up a little bit more. There are also lots of bright work around the cabin, which again uplifts the overall interior ambience quite a bit. Now, ahead of the driver is a new set of instruments, within which sits a full-color multi-info display. Now, the display itself is relatively good. It's got good graphics and relatively good animations, but the use of it is a little bit odd because you have these 2 buttons here to scroll through all the settings and change stuff and whatever, and this is just not very intuitive. And the trip computer is accessed via a button on the stalk for the information, and again, unless someone tells you they're there, it's very difficult to figure out. But in terms of the things that I do like I said, I like these seats, and I like the fact the GKUI system is now an always connected system, and so your navigation, your music player, for example, is always connected to the internet via the car's own data plan, which means you don't need to hook it up to your phone. Unfortunately, this and the new Iris do not come with Apple CarPlay or Android Auto at all, which is a glaring omission for a car built in 2021. That said, the GKUI unit does come with some degree of voice command, so you can tell it to open the driver's side window, for example, or to adjust the air conditioning. But its capabilities are relatively limited because, again, this car was not built with GKUI in mind, and so there are only a handful of things that it can control. But that said, all these changes to the interior are nice, yes, but we have to look at the fundamentals of this car. So for starters, the rear space is slightly better than the Iris. You get a little bit more legroom and you can sit with a little bit more recline, so you can be a bit more comfortable in here. But when you're talking about the drive, that's where Proton claims most of the changes have been made. So let's get out on the road and see how it drives. Now, behind the wheel of the Proton Persona, now I must admit that I haven't actually driven the Persona before. For some reason, I just was never offered an opportunity to test drive this car, so it's quite fun to be behind the wheel of one now. The Persona is quite a popular car within the B segment saloon market, and I can begin to see why. It is quite comfortable and it's quite spacious in here. The boot is very capacious. Now, the thing is, we've actually got this car on the same week as the Proton Iris Active, and it's interesting to see the differences between these cars. Now, one would assume that the differences would be quite minor. Ultimately, this uses the same 1.6-litre VVT engine and the same Punch CVT gearbox with power going to the front wheels. But in actuality, these cars present themselves quite differently. For starters, this doesn't feel nearly as agile as the Iris. The Iris feels very chuckable, if you'd let me use that term, and the Persona certainly doesn't, which I feel fits its character a little bit more. Ultimately, this is a sort of car that will be purchased by young adults, young executives, or growing families, the kind of people who will want the comfort of 5 seats and a large boot for longer distance drives, or even for going out for the weekly shop. And to that end, I think this car does quite well. The engine is relatively quiet. The gearbox is miles better than the first time I encountered the Punch CVT, and so it certainly feels like the sort of car that you can live with over a longer term without too much hassle, that's for sure. And in terms of the interior appointments, I must admit this is a very nice place to be. You have these tan faux leather seats. You also have this relatively dark dashboard with a little bit more of that faux leather on the doors, and a lighter colored roof liner. And as a result, this car feels like a much posher place to be in than it necessarily is. I think the change to this tan faux leather has made a huge difference in terms of increasing and improving the perceived quality in here. Quality is something that I want to touch on because I've driven quite a few cars lately, mostly from non-national brands, and what amazes me is a lot of them have been sort of squeaking and rattling and that sort of thing. These cars have nothing. Both the Iris and the Persona, especially the Persona, have had no rattles, no squeaks whatsoever, which says a lot about Proton build quality. It also says a lot about the stiffness of this chassis. When the Iris came out, it was the first Proton to use hot press form steel in its construction, and Proton talked a lot about how that makes the chassis very rigid, which improves things like ride and handling, as well as in terms of the NVH and squeaks and rattles and that sort of thing. And you can definitely feel it with this car. Nothing rattles, nothing shakes, which is very, very impressive, particularly for something at this price point. Now, in terms of the overall equipment, there have been some changes. So now you have the floating GKUI system, you have a slightly redesigned dashboard, slightly redesigned center console, all that I've touched on before. And I have to say that it does make this car feel a little bit more trendy, a little bit more on point compared to where it used to be. I think that the Iris and the Persona both they're starting to feel their age a bit, because these cars are not nearly as new as the competition, and that might be a little bit of a downfall for them. But because of these updates, it feels like it's still kind of fresh. You can still use these cars for a while. They can still sit in showrooms and still be quite impressive for some time. But if you ask me, in terms of the drive, yes, through B roads and stuff like that, it can shuffle, but it doesn't want you to. On the highway, it's very refined. There is a little bit of wind noise, a little bit of road noise, but it's nothing more than what you'd expect from this segment. In terms of the powertrain, I think anything above the national speed limit and the engine starts to sort of kick a fuss a bit because it kind of runs out of puff. And the gearbox is relatively responsive. On the highway, on flowing roads and stuff like that, this gearbox is quite responsive. But it's when you're stuck in sort of stop and start traffic jams, that sort of thing, that's when the punch CVT kind of falls short a little bit. It can be a little bit slow to react, not nearly as slow as it used to be, but it's still far from perfect. But what I think, beyond the powertrain, which I think is something that you will learn to live with, but I think the aspect of this car that really requires active thought and active consideration when buying is safety. Now, when these cars came out, of course, with this new powertrain, with this new platform and with the hot press form steel, they were given 5 ANCAP stars. But times have moved on. They're still officially rated at 5 ANCAP stars, but the lack of active safety is starting to get a little bit more pronounced. No blind spot monitoring, no AEB, no rear cross traffic alert, that sort of thing. It's a bit difficult, I think. I feel like modern cars these days and buyers today really ought to demand the bare minimum, which is autonomous emergency braking. Things like lane keep assist and stuff like that is slightly less than necessary, but AEB and blind spot monitoring are two necessary things in our market. We have a lot of bikes which can tend to disappear in blind spots, so having blind spot monitoring will be very helpful. And in terms of AEB, because a lot of us drive over highways, traffic jams and stuff like that, having autonomous emergency braking, an extra pair of eyes for when we're tired or when we're not necessarily paying attention, or even when the worst happens and we can't react fast enough, it's not a luxury. We need to start demanding for AEB. But that said, Proton did say that they surveyed owners and they asked them what they want to see from these cars, and so active safety was not included because apparently that's not what buyers wanted from the new Persona as well as the new Iris. So they're fulfilling customer demands, yes, but at what cost? Honestly, that is the biggest demerit against these cars, the fact that there is a lack of active safety. I feel like that is something that Proton definitely should rectify, and I'm confident that they will with the next generation. But overall, what I can say is, when people used to ask us about Protons, particularly the Persona and the Iris, people used to ask, hey, these cars good? And we'd be like, yeah, they're good, but, and there's always that but. That but was usually with regards to the gearbox and in terms of the overall NVH, because of the gearbox, because of the engine. And I'm happy to say, I'm very proud to report that you no longer have to have that big pause anymore. This gearbox and this powertrain, this engine is much improved than before, and now you can buy these cars without the compromise that they used to entail. I feel like this would be a very good consideration for people looking for a B-segment saloon that is both affordable to run and affordable to buy, and relatively reliable, and relatively spacious, and relatively practical. They're really good cars. I'm very impressed with this PROTON Persona. If you were looking within this segment, it would be a very easy recommendation, I feel. But that's been our review of the new PROTON Persona Premium. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so you're notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, jangan bodoh.